Hi, everyone. As our wonderful director, Jill Berry, would say, we're ready to get started here. So welcome. My name is Greer Luce. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven, and I'm thrilled on behalf of the museum to welcome you tonight for the fourth and final program in our Grand Homes and Gardens series. First, I wanted to start by thanking our wonderful sponsors for this program. So for the Grand Homes and Gardens series, I'd like to thank Hilton's Princeton. And I'm going to invite Nick Hilton, if you wouldn't mind, to come up and say a few words if you'd like.
Right now?
Yeah.
Get more of a warm-up. And I never know what I'm going to say. Jennifer said, you have to say something different tonight because you said the same thing for the last So, this is it. We're glad to look at it. Very nicely dressed people. There's a CPA firm upstairs from our store. And anyway. It's depressing. Come and see us. I guess I was supposed to say that from the beginning, but I didn't realize it until Marcia Shackelford just reminded me. Anyway, we didn't do that. We didn't do this for that. We actually, I'm really, I didn't know, this is an embarrassing thing to say, I didn't know anything about Morven until we were asked to sponsor this and agreed. And I'm fascinated. This is the first time I've ever been here in the daylight. By the one thing, it's a beautiful place, and we're grateful for the opportunity to be associated with this wonderful thing. And I've learned a lot. These lectures have been, educational, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I'd also like to thank the sponsor for this program on Bartram's Garden, Keller Williams Princeton Realty. And I'd like to invite another Nick, Nick Lopez, if you wouldn't mind coming up to say a few words. Thank you so much.
I actually had another meeting. I usually don't wear a suit, but I'm happy I did. So, Nick and Nick, ready to go. So we're good. So along the same lines, I'm very proud and honored to say that we have sponsored this before. Morven is amazing. I grew up as a kid in the area going to Westminster Youth Chorale. I came here with my family as a child. I'm very honored to be able to help sponsor something like this. History, what we've seen in these lectures is very important. This is where we come from, who we are, and it's something I'm very proud to say, being part of a brokerage that's been in Princeton for 22 years now, that I can pass along to my children as well and have them continue to be part of this amazing place and the history it provides. So thank you again so much for coming. I appreciate you being here. We all appreciate you being here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nick. So I'd like to extend some final thank yous to the staff here at Morven that have made this series possible. First and foremost, Joe Murphy, who is our wonderful tech guru and is making this program possible for us here, but also for everyone who's joining from home tonight. So thank you so much, Joe. I'd also like to thank Kathy O'Hara, who is not here tonight, but she is responsible for all of the wonderful food and beverage that you've been partaking in for the past couple of programs. And tonight we have Diana Griffin and Diana Sealer, who were game to take over and volunteer their time tonight to help us out with refreshments. I'd also like to thank Megan Shackney and Louise Sr., who have been a big part of supporting this program as well. So this is our final program in our 2023 Grand Homes and Gardens series, the theme of which has been Trailblazers and Trendsetters. Throughout this series, we have traveled from Manitoga and the imagination of iconic designers Russell and Mary Wright to the beautiful storytelling of Madam C.J. Walker's great-great-granddaughter, Alelia Bundles. And then we traveled to the glorious and unique interiors of Beauport on Massachusetts' northern shore last week. We are closing out the series tonight in America's oldest botanic garden, Bartram's Garden. Not only is the 14-acre garden in Philadelphia, PA, home to a collection of plant species collected, grown, and studied by the Bartram family from 1728 to 1850, today the site provides communal space, sustainable farming opportunities, and so much more for its surrounding neighborhoods. We're going to hear a lot about that tonight as well. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Aseel Rasheed. Aseel comes to Bartram's Garden with a diverse background in service, science, and the arts. Her interest is in creating spaces that are welcoming and in service to all. She leads a team of creatives in producing education, river, arts and culture, and interpretive programming for the public in partnership with the local community. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Aseel.
Good evening, everyone. It's it's honored to be here at Morven. This is my first time at Morven too, but I do know a little bit about the history of Princeton and how rich it is. So thank you for inviting Bartram's Garden to be part of this series, which makes me nervous that it's called Trailblazers and Trendsetters, but I will do my best to live up to it. And I just want to say that, gardens are places where we relax and find peace. They're places where we remember that we are part of nature and not separate from it. And they're places that nurture us, literally and figuratively. They feed us, they give us medicine, and they bring us a sense of peace a lot of times. So that's kind of like the conversation at Bartram's is rooted in this idea. So I kind of invite you all here and at home to just kind of relax. I'm happy to give a very casual presentation to you. I'm very, very excited for your questions and to hear from you. So I'll try and kind of tell as quick a story as I can, although the story is quite long, so that we can get to the conversation part of the evening. So again, my name is Aseel Rasheed. I'm the Public Programs Director at Bartram's Garden. I've been there for about 8 years. And though this is thought to be the oldest botanic garden in North America, dating to 1728, kind of the story that I'll tell you is of the most recent 10 years. And a little bit about what it was like before those 10 years. So, I was very grateful to talk to a few people here before we started the presentation. And there are lots of people that have never heard of Bartram's Garden, don't know that it's in the middle of the city. Surprised to see that photo in the beginning and kind of like imagine it in a really urban space. I can tell you that Bartram's Garden is in Southwest Philadelphia. It's a kind of corner of Philadelphia, the kind of lower southwest corner, very close to the airport, actually, if you've been there. And it's right on the banks of the Schuylkill River. So Philadelphia has 2 rivers, one large river, the Delaware, which separates us from New Jersey, and then also the smaller river, the Schuylkill River, which is all part of the Delaware River watershed. And we're right on the banks of this river, kind of like sleepy place. And mostly because this section of the city was the kind of like the industrial hearth of Philadelphia over the 20th century. If I walked you through the garden, I can show you where the buildings were that produced all of the cement that built all of the roads and bridges and buildings in the city. I can show you where the factory was that built all the gypsum, that built all the row homes in Philadelphia. They were all kind of surrounding this garden during the industrial age. So it's kind of like a miracle that it's still here, because it was able to survive that era of industry. It was able to survive a period of kind of like private ownership by a wealthy family that kind of wanted to sell it off as industry was coming to the area. It survived the revolution when the military marched through Bartram's garden on their way to Philadelphia. And it has a really rich story to tell over time. But it also tells a different kind of story where if you had arrived there 10 years ago, you would find the garden ill maintained, kind of overgrown, and you would find a very small group of people who felt like they had found this incredible treasure that they would kind of visit on their own all of the time from outside of the neighborhood, you know? And you would find neighborhood folks there too, but you'd see them on the edges of the site. They would come in the evening, like at sunset. They'd fish in areas along the river where you couldn't see them. And it was not a place that felt connected to the people that lived around it. So I can tell you a little bit more about where Bertram's Garden is. Um, it is in a neighborhood that is almost entirely Black. It's home to one of the largest African immigrant populations on the East Coast. Its immediate neighbor is the largest public housing in Philadelphia. So there are 500 units of public housing with 2,000 people living in them. The median income there is $12,000. You may know that the Philadelphia is one of the poorest large cities in America. It has about 30% of its population living under the poverty line. So when we would go out to the neighborhood 10 years ago, when the garden came under new leadership, um, and say, hey, are you using this garden? Do you know about it? It's a public park. It's free to visit. It's open for you to use however you want. Um, are you using it? And they'd say, what are you talking about? There's no park there. And they'd be like, oh, it's right behind Bartram's Village, the housing. It's like right on the waterfront. Do you know it? And they'd say, do you mean that private estate where we're not supposed to go? And there was this real disconnect between what the purpose of this place was, or how it was used, or how it was understood, or how it was being kind of um, how the garden was working to welcome the people around it. And I think whatever was happening there was kind of distancing the neighborhood from that space. So the work of the last 10 years has been to try as best we can, with as much progress as we can, you know, to start ourselves on a path when where we say that the function of this space, which is public, which is owned by every single Philadelphian, to come use and make useful to themselves, how to make it welcoming to them. So we kind of started on a journey of that, of asking questions like, why do you think it's private? You know, what makes it feel that way? How can we make it more welcoming to you? What do you want to use it for? How could it help your life? How could it sustain you? How could it bring you peace? All those things that we talked about what a garden can do for you. We started to think about, you know, how can we deliver those outcomes to you through this space? So I'll get started to introduce you a little bit more to the site. It's a 50-acre park. It's quite lovely. And if I could get a little bit closer here. In the center here where it says D is kind of like the heart of the garden. That's the original site of the historic buildings, of the historic botanic garden. But it has this beautiful meadow, which became part of the property in the 1980s after that concrete factory went out of business. To the right is where it says E is Sankofa Community Farm, which is a farm that started at the site about 10 years ago. Um, and it's right next to where that gypsum factory would have been that I mentioned to you. And you can see that the map stretches out even beyond the meadow on the left. And that's because the city has been bringing its trails to Southwest Philadelphia. We've been working in collaboration to the city And now there's a trail that runs the length of our park. And its goal is to cross the river and connect with the larger kind of pedestrian cycling way in Philadelphia called the Schuylkill River Trail to the north and to the south. And our Schuylkill River Trail is actually part of a larger system of trails that's part of the East Coast Greenway, which is this kind of long-term dream that there's going to be a walking and cycling path that goes from Maine to Florida. So this is all part of that connection. And the idea of that was that, you know, you normally the Schuylkill River Trail, like if you see it, it's kind of like it's in Center City, it's in very affluent parts of the neighborhood, but this will be an opportunity to bring it into Southwest Philadelphia, to bring access to people who live here into the like other parts of Philadelphia. This park, which is part of the Philadelphia park system, which is largely continuous in other areas of the city, is not contiguous, but this trail is going to make it connect to that larger park system and to Center City where there are jobs and other opportunities. So that's a kind of idea of what the site looks like. And it's this extraordinary place because it's on a riverfront. You heard in the introduction a little bit, you know, this place dates back to the 1700s. In the 1700s, there were no cars, there were no roads. People were coming and going to this site by boat. And what they were doing is they were really interested in native species of North America. They're really curious about these plants that they knew nothing about because, you know, they were exotic to them, essentially, right? So these were Europeans that had come to the Philadelphia area and were like fascinated by all of these plants. So this family in particular who are Quaker, and like the Quakers have a real kind of like tie to nature and medicine and those kinds of connections, were super interested in plants. And not only did they make it their life's work to like collect these plants all across the east coast of North America, but also to collect them, propagate them, and sell them at pretty kind of exorbitant prices to European gardeners who are starting collections in Europe. So, like, we have a lot of visitors that come from Europe because a lot of their species there they know came to them from Bartram's garden in Philadelphia in the 1700s. So that's another thing about the park that wasn't happening 10 years ago. No one really paid attention to the fact that it was on this river. I should say that immediately across the river from this site was the largest and oldest petroleum refinery on the East Coast. So it was a real juxtaposition when you were on this land to be in this garden that had all of this history, to be immediately next to Bartram's village, and to on the other side of you have this you know, this really visible and kind of like you could feel in your body this kind of environmental kind of impact that was happening just across the river. I should say that that refinery went out of business a couple of years ago. You may have heard they had a giant explosion and they've since gone out of business and dismantled a lot of the refinery that was there. So there's a really new landscape that we see from the edge of the river. But this kind of gives you a kind of idea of the scale and size of the site. And these are local artists that have worked to make these little designs that we work with to make our map kind of fresh. And whenever I talk about the garden, I like to introduce the team. So this is my team. These are members of our programs team at Bartram's Garden. We have a larger team that goes beyond this, folks who are maintaining the grounds, the gardeners that work there. We also have a team that maintains our agricultural land, the Sankofa Farm group of farmers. And then we have our kind of like other folks that support all of the work that we do in development or marketing, finance, administration, all these different areas. So we have a team of about 35 full-time staff, but many, many other people that contribute to the work that happens at the garden. So the full team, like with all of the members of the team, these are kind of the managers on the programs team, but the full team is about 17 people. So it's a large group of folks doing that work. But they also work with about 50 paid high school interns that are on our site year round, kind of doing the work of the garden and learning about it. As well as volunteers and additional part-time and seasonal staff just that support the work that's happening. And these are their names and some of the work that they do. Kind of tell you a little bit about the story, a little bit more about kind of like what were the programs that we introduced over the 10 years and how did we change the work that's happening. And at the end, I'll tell you about kind of the future looking projects that are coming to the garden. So I'll start, I think, a video. So you'll see a loop of some of the images of our programming. And I'll tell you the story of it. And if we have time, I'll go through one by one and tell you kind of some of the stuff that's happening. So as I mentioned, like our first thing that we did was kind of go out into the neighborhood and kind of see what people wanted and what we could do for them. And over time, that would develop into all different kinds of programming and all different things that we could make happen on the site. I think kind of one of the most dramatic interventions that we had was the Sankova Community Farm. So the farm has 3 values that they operate on. One is African diaspora. So they're talking about the crops that come from Africa, but also that come from other cultures. But it's kind of connecting people of the African diaspora to land and to their foodways of their cultural pasts, and to teach that we all have these foodways and these pasts, right? We all have kind of a connection to the land as a form of sustenance. And they also kind of teach food sovereignty, how you can grow your own food, how you can have the skills to produce your own food and to feed yourself. And that's kind of like a right of your culture and your past and the people that came before you. Their other value is intergenerationality. So they were the first youth program that we had on our site, youth development program. We've grown to other kinds of kind of youth focused programming on our site, but it originated on the farm. We now have a youth program that works on the river, and we have a youth program that works focusing on kind of neighborhood environmental equity issues, specifically related around trees and how to bring more canopy into Southwest Philadelphia. The third value of the farm is spirituality. So they kind of do kind of work with the land and work with their seeds in a spiritual way, keeping in mind kind of those connections to the past that are all part of that work. So that was kind of like one on the southern end, something that was happening that was really kind of like connecting people to Bartram's Garden in a way they had never connected before. It was connecting different kinds of people to the garden. Prior to that, kind of like the visitation of the site was kind of like, you may be familiar with garden goers and garden lovers who would come to the site. We're excited about the historic home, but this introduced a new population to Bartram's Garden who was very close but had never been there. The second kind of major program that we started was on the river, to kind of say that this is a special site because it's a river garden. And the way that we did that was to build like a like to have that program be kind of steeped and focused in community. So what we did is we started a community boathouse. And what that meant was that we were able to hire one person who had a real deep, deep, deep love for the Schuylkill River. And she was able to get 2 freight containers donated. She was able to send an email out to everyone she knew and said, hey, listen, if you have a kayak you're not using that's in your house, or you have a kayak but you don't have a car, or you have a kayak and you don't want to lift it, you can come put it in our container. We'll give you the key. You can store it here right on the edge of the river, and you can come use it whenever you want, except for 4 hours on Saturday. Your boat's going to belong to the public. And also, because you know how to use a boat on the river, you also have to donate 20 hours of your time to help other people that don't know how to get on the river, So she started this incredible volunteer boathouse where she had almost 100 volunteers running public programming on Saturday with these donated boats to get thousands of people on the water who had never been on the water. And since then, we don't depend on borrowed boats, but we still depend on volunteers. So that program is always run by volunteers and is still accessible, right? But if you're a volunteer and giving your time to help people on the water, you still get a key to the boathouse so you can boat whenever you want. And as I mentioned, that spread to a youth program. So now there's a youth program associated with the river called the Densham River Guardians. And initially it was like, how do we bring kids to the river? How do we introduce them to the river? What's that going to be like? And then the path that that program took is really quite extraordinary. We had these rules set around when we would have boating programs and when we would cancel boating programs. Because, the first thing people say when you're like, come get on this kayak and get on the Schuylkill River, they say, is the Schuylkill safe to be in? Is it clean to be in? And we'd be like, well, yeah, we think so. But there actually wasn't any data being collected on this southern kind of post-industrial site of the river. So these youth took it upon themselves to do regular water quality monitoring on this stretch of the river. And they've been learning to do that science, but to also do that advocacy. So they've been advocating to environmental agencies to change it's like detailed stuff, but to change the kind of like way these environmental agencies look at that stretch of the river and how they determine the like water quality benchmarks that have to be met on that stretch of the river. And they're getting traction from their advocacy, which is really extraordinary. And they are also the people that are helping the Saturday program run. So they're also out there learning how to use the boats and how to help people and get them on the water. The other part of that program that grew kind of organically was we brought this boating program, but like everyone in the neighborhood was like, we've never been on boats. That's scary. We don't want to get in the water. But they're like, we've been fishing over there and you're like getting in our way. And so we started a fishing program. And part of that was to build new piers and new docks and new places where people could fish safely and well, but also to kind of have like fun fish offs and little fishing programs where people could come that didn't have the skill. During COVID, we also sold bait at our welcome center. Our visitor center sold live bait so people could fish. And it was one of the few places in the neighborhood where you could get live bait. And during COVID, people were really upset because they wanted to fish, but our visitor center was closed and there was nowhere to get bait. So we became the only location, I understand, in all of Philadelphia to have a live bait vending machine. But we found a guy that had a live bait vending machine, and he, honestly, he was like, I'm not putting my vending machine. It's gonna get vandalized. I won't bring it there. And it took a lot of negotiation. We were like, we'll put it in this place. It'll be safe. We'll try it for a little bit. If it goes okay, maybe you'll decide to keep it. And it ended up being, he's like, this is my most lucrative machine that I have of any of the ones that I own. Yeah, you can see folks fishing here. We don't charge anything. Oh, for the bait? The vending machine charges. It's the guy's vending machine. It's not our bait. But like for any of our programming or to come to the garden, we charge nothing at all. There are some programs that we have that do have costs. We do that. Originally, they were all free. Like we'd have workshops and things and we would have them be free and folks would register and not show up. And we just found it was better to charge. And then we provide a discount for people that we want to prioritize. So if you live in our neighborhood, then you only pay $2 for anything that costs anything. So if there's anything that has a ticketed price, if you live in the neighborhood, you only pay $2. So that's also part of like an established program in Philadelphia called Art Reach. So we kind of like copied that model and we offer that at our site as well. So everything costs $2 if you live in the neighborhood. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I think those were the two main anchoring kind of giant interventions that really made the initial change at Bartram's Garden. It was, there were two things that weren't focused in gardening exactly. They weren't about native plants. They weren't about the colonial history of the site. But to my mind, and from everything that I've ever learned about this place, they were in the spirit of the Bartram family because these were people that just loved nature. They wanted to be curious around the world around them, about the world around them, and they wanted to share that with other people too, always. They were well known as being a place of like sharing information around plants. So I think this carries out the spirit of that kind of founding of the Bartram family, but it opens it up to access it in different ways. Though I'm the program director at Bartram's Garden, I often say that, my ultimate goal is that you don't come for a program and that you just show up and you like have a picnic here, or you take a walk here, or you sit by the river here, because there is value in this park just as a park for people. But all of our programs are like a doorway or an entranceway or an introduction into what the park can be if you require that invitation. Certainly there are people that don't need that invitation, but there are some people that do need that invitation and that welcome and that path for them to be introduced to the site. I would say kind of like the third um really kind of like big and maybe even next part that's like creating the shift of what's happening in Bartram's Garden is the conversation around history. So for a long time, the history of Bartram's Garden has been rooted in this family and their era. They were on site from 1728 to 1850. And I'll just tell you a little bit of a story, which is when I arrived there, I originally kind of worked in visitor services. And when I got my job, I was going to do that kind of work. And they were like, oh, by the way, we have this tour program. Can you help us out with that? You have to do some tours. So I was like, I don't know anything about this place. So I sat with our curator, Joel Fry, who is just the foremost scholar on the Bartram family and this piece of land on our planet, kind of knows everything around about it. And he taught me about the history of that place from his own perspective, which was as an anthropologist and an archaeologist. He has worked at that site for his entire life. He's been there since he was in high school, and he holds so much history inside of him. And I was able to sit with him for a really long time and just kind of learn how, if you talk about one place, if you view history through one place, one kind of focused, solid place, then you can really more easily put history in context in a way that sometimes you're not able to do when you're studying history in school or through other methodologies. So he really gave me a new perspective about how history works, as it was like from the perspective of a family of like regular people, right? These weren't kind of like special people. They were just a regular family running a business. And from their perspective, history really, really changed. And I started learning things that like he was like, oh, we've never shared that. Things about, that Bartram's Garden is one of the premier prehistoric archaeological sites in our area. We found evidence that people were gathering on the edge of our river 5,000 years ago. They found evidence of their fires from that time. So I was like, we should be sharing this information. One time I said, who's lived in the house besides the Bartrams? And he said, well, these tax records that we've recently found tell us that there was a Black family living in this house in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But we don't know anything about them. We don't know their names. We don't know their relationship to the Bartrams. We don't know the details of their lives. So one of the things that we did was to try and figure out what we didn't know and try and share it. So we started working with an incredible historian. Her name is Charisse Blakeney, who also works here at Moorhead. And she started finding history for us. She hasn't been able to find the identity of the family that lived in the house. There's also folklore of another man named Harvey that was on the land. That was part of her assignment to find, that she hasn't found the history of Harvey yet. But she found this incredible history of people living in this community in what she called different levels of freedom. People who were free and Black in the neighborhood, people who had been enslaved, or people who had been um, manumitted, who'd purchased their own slavery, their own freedom, to be released from their enslavement. Um, and there were like all these different kinds of histories that she uncovered. And we published her work in a book called Stories We Know. And we called it that because we knew that we had just started on a path to learning things that we hadn't known before. And we're committed to learning more about that and sharing more about those histories. We know also that, all of the Delaware River watershed is part of Lenapehoking, which is the ancestral land of the Lenape people. Our immediate neighborhood in Southwest is called Kingsessing, which is the Lenape word that means the place with the meadows. So we know that the history is here, even though if you go all the way back to the Bartram era, he came here in 1699, built his house on this land in 1728. Even that early, many of the native people had already been moved west. Um, at that early stage, had been kind of like were already gone in large numbers. So um, it's a really old story, but I think it's still there to tell, and it's still in the land to tell, and it's still in the plants to tell. So I think those are the three major areas. And these pictures tell some of the other kinds of stories, um, other kinds of programming that we do, health and wellness programming, doing yoga by the river. This is our partnership with the Philadelphia Bicycle Coalition, where we offer free bike rentals. You can come and take classes and learn to ride as an adult. You can come and take classes and learn to ride as a child. You can take riding basics classes. You can learn how to ride on our trail. This is all kind of work that we're doing that's going to lead up to that bridge crossing that I mentioned, where Southwest is going to connect to Center City. So folks will have all of the skills and whatever they might need to be able to use that trail effectively. We have camps during the summer that are free. This one's called Royal by Nature, where kids come and have free programming all summer long. This is a copy of Stories We Know that I mentioned that we published. It was designed with this artistry on the right that when we did the research and went to the libraries, we were mostly reading documents of indenture. And when they cut the contracts, they would write 2 copies and they would cut them in this design so that to prove that they were real, you would put them together and they would have to fit together like a jigsaw piece. But that was the artistry that was for. But we continue to have plant sales, a lot of plant education. There's some plant-centered programming that we're doing. I was talking to some folks earlier. We have a program called Build Your Home Apothecary, which is like a year-round seasonal program where, again, folks are learning how to make use of the land. So you learn how to plant plants that are medicinal, how to grow them, how to process them, how to turn them into medicine, and how to use them. We have a lot of children's programming. So in addition to our youth programming, we have regular field trips for kids K through 8. We have several partnerships with local schools where certain classrooms will come back multiple times throughout the year. So we're kind of building relationships with special kids, specific kids, so that they're building relationships with the parks. This is some of our river programming that happens. Folks out in kayaks on our riverway. Let's see. Some of our anglers, longtime anglers. It's been a nice relationship to have kind of new families coming to learn how to fish alongside people who've been fishing for a long time. In the early years of the river program, we'd wanted to get a lot of attention drawn. So we'd have these giant festivals where people would build their own boats and they'd have parades in the river. And, a lot of people would come. We're experimenting with different styles of boats that we've been able to get to have different kinds of experiences. We were recently able to kind of expand our dock to make it much larger, but also to kind of make space for ability. So it has kayak slips built in. So it makes it easier for people to get in boats and get out of boats. This is a very lovely photo from our fishing programming. Having a lot of fun. We did a study just before, I think it was about 5 years ago, and it was meant to happen twice. It was meant to happen before the bridge crossing opened and then after the bridge crossing opened. But 5 years ago, 5 years into this change and into this programming, we had found that our visitorship had more than doubled, and that we were seeing over 100,000 visitors on our site per year 5 years ago. And the demographics of those visitors were in line with the city's demographics. This is Yasir Hall. He's one of our Densham River Guardians. He came to us as a high school student. He's now he was like the very first of our apprentices. So we started a program because kids like Yasir that had been with us through their high school lives were like, I don't want to go to college and I want to stay here and keep learning. So we started these apprenticeship programs so they could stay. And Yasir is still with us. Even though he worked on the river, he was interested in horticulture. So he's a member of our horticulture team and he's been doing gardening. And he's planting a garden for that person that I mentioned that we're looking into named Harvey, because he wants something on site to tell his story. So he's leading that effort to tell that history. These are the students from Sankofa Farm. To the right over there is our farmer, Chris Bolden Newsom, and with the hat on, that's Ty Holmberg. They're the founders of the garden and the directors. Students harvesting. In addition to youth growing food, what happens to the food that's prepared is it gets sold in the neighborhood. So right outside Bartram's Village, that housing that's next door to us, they'll sell all of that organic hand-grown produce at really, really low prices. Some arts and culture programming that we do, culturally relevant to the folks in the neighborhood. Oftentimes, made by the people in the neighborhood. We hire a lot of artists in the neighborhood to do work. We're back at the beginning. Then I think if I push forward, Joe, it will get. So then I wanted to tell you about some of the projects that are coming. So all of this work over the last 10 years has really advanced the garden in what it can do and what it will do into the future. And all of these really big projects I'm going to tell you about are largely in partnership with other organizations. This is our Ecosystems Education Center and Mussel Hatchery, which we are building in partnership with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. This is going to be the largest mussel hatchery, production site, but it's going to produce 500,000 mussels a year, and they are not for us to eat, but they're designed for cleaning the waterway. So they're going to be introduced to the Schuylkill River and other areas of the watershed to enhance its water quality. It's also going to include this education center. So they're going to bring their hatchery. PD is bringing their hatchery, and we're bringing our education center so that we can have more space for this growing programming that we're doing on a regular basis. And it's also going to have a commercial kitchen, and that is for the farm youth to use and the farm program to use, because they're also interested in cooking and learning how to prepare the foods that they're growing and serve them to other people. And it'll be commercial because we know there are a lot of people in the community that have need for a commercial kitchen. So it will be something that we'll be able to share, a resource we can share. A lot of what we do at the garden is give away whatever resources that we have. So if we have space that is of value to our neighbors, we will try and give it away to them. So having more space is always useful for that. We have a really beautiful events pavilion that one of our partners holds for weddings. But weddings happen on weekends. So on weekdays, it's generally available. So we'll use it for our own programming, or we will give it away to a partnering nonprofit that can't afford a big space for their fundraiser, or even we've given it away for birthday parties or graduations or memorials or showers or book releases. If someone publishes something, all these different kinds of things that happen in a person's life, we are very honored that people want to hold their kind of family and life events on our site. So we try and give away our space for that. So this new site will have space for that as well. This is very fancy, I think. This is a structure called Float Lab. It's designed by Mi-Jin Yoon of Haller and Yoon Architecture. It's a really interesting design. This is completely made out of steel, And it's designed in the way that a submarine is designed. So it has a ballast system that allows it to move up and down as the Schuylkill River's tide comes in and out. And it's designed so that when you approach it from the ramp and you first step on it, your feet will be level with the river, with the surface of the river. But as you walk around it to the other end, you can see the people on the left side. You'll kind of be submerged and you'll be at eye level with the water. So it's this beautiful architectural invention that is kind of designed to give you a new perspective on the waterway. And it is our job to program this lovely architectural piece. So there are some things where we hope to use it to advance our river program. So like we asked them to put cleats on it so our kayaks could dock on it. We'll use it certainly to advance our water quality monitoring work. And also we're using it to launch a swim program. Not because you can swim in the Schuylkill River, nor do we recommend that you swim in the river. But we do know that that can be a barrier for being close to the river, fishing by the river, or boating on the river. So we're offering very specific kind of like swim lessons and to increase people's comfort along a waterway. That's a project that is in collaboration with Mural Arts Philadelphia. And, you know, that has long been in planning for many years. But the timeline now is that this is being built over the next year. And it will be arriving kind of in the time in about a year and a half at Bartram's Garden. There's another site on the north end of the site that we are looking to develop as our field station and welcome center. You know, the site is so large that you want to be welcoming. There's so many ways to enter it that you want to be welcoming from all directions. But the thought is that we're working currently to think about what are the proper partnerships to develop to kind of center, you know, the garden's thinking in climate resilience and how like our knowledge can contribute to that work and how kind of our work with young people can contribute to that work. How do we get their voices and the community voices that we've been building? How do we bring those into a climate conversation? But that will be the kind of the centering idea under that project. And this is another project where it's not exactly our project. So there's a piece of land immediately adjacent to the park that is available. And we have partnered with Woodland Academy, which is a 4-star early education center just across the street from Bartram's Garden, who we've partnered with for a very long time. And we've been working with them to develop a plan to move their education center to be immediately adjacent to our park. So there will be an outdoor, nature focused early education center immediately adjacent to this park in Southwest Philadelphia. I think this is a long-term project. They're in the kind of like fundraising and kind of feasibility stages right now. But we did do kind of a both of these two projects, this and the field station, were part of a community process that went on for a couple of years to work with a group of residents and local leaders in the neighborhood who we call the Southwest Leadership Circle. We worked with them to kind of like come up with the ideas about what would happen with these two pieces of land that are adjacent to our park. And these were the ideas that emerged and that we're trying to advance. And that is the Bartram House, where it all started. I welcome you all here in the room and at home to come and visit the park. As I mentioned, it's a public space. It's free to all. You can come any time of day and take a walk there. It's really an interesting and lovely place to spend time. And it has changed over time. So if you haven't been there in a long while, come back because it is different now. It feels different now. There have been kind of structural changes there. You'll see a lot of new things if you haven't been there before. I'm sorry, I forgot to keep track of time. Am I very over or am I very under? It's okay.
You are okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Is the house open to the public?
The house has been open to the public in the past. It's not currently open to the public. So it had been open for tours on a regular basis, but we closed it at the start of the pandemic and have not yet reopened it. We're looking to revive our tour program and kind of refresh it and have plans to reopen it.
One other question. Family. You said the Bartrams were Quakers?
They were, yeah.
So they did not enslave people?
Well, No, they do have a history of enslavement. I should say they started out as Quakers. Almost none of them ended up as Quakers. John was read out of Quaker meetings, so at his later age, he didn't remain a Quaker. Some of his children started the Free Quakers. They wanted to fight during the Revolution. But we do know that William started a plantation in Florida. And as part of that work, he had a conversation with his father, telling him that he needed enslaved labor to run that plantation. And John did purchase 6 slaves that he sent to Florida to work with William there. And Charisse has actually been working hard to find out kind of what happened to those 6 individuals. She's done research into knowing them better, understanding the history of that transaction, the kind of conversation that was part of that. And now she's really interested in knowing what happened to them. William's business ultimately failed, so it didn't go on for a really long time, but there's no record of what happened to those 6 individuals. So she's looking for that. And you're right, there was a period where Quakers early abolished slavery, but I don't think that meant that was true for all Quakers.
Why do you suppose the property was never developed? Why did it not change hands after 1850? That time. How do you account for that?
So the Bartrams held the land for 3 generations, and then they actually lost it. Like, they were not in a good, stable financial situation. So a very wealthy railroad man named Andrew Eastwick came and took over all of their land. And he actually built a giant mansion on the site, which isn't there anymore. It burned down in a fire. But he lived there for a portion of his life. He had 14 children, and he died just at the turn of the century, like just before the turn of the century in the 1890s. And he loved the garden and took really, really good care of it, preserved a lot of elements of the garden, preserved a lot of the historic buildings the Bartrams had. But his children were like, we don't care. We're going to sell it all off. And they started cutting up the land. It was a 300-acre piece of property. So they started cutting it up and selling it off to industry. And they were planning to sell the garden, but there was a gardener, Thomas Meehan, a botanist, who had worked on the land their father had hired to work the land. And he was kind of committed to stopping them from selling it, and kind of like committed his life to kind of protesting the sale of it, and eventually became a council person in Philadelphia, and kind of convinced the city that the land had value, convinced them to take it over. And they were like, well, the family won't give it to us for free. We can't afford to buy it. So he raised money so the city could buy the land and turn it into public space. So it's only for that reason that it became part of city land and part of the park system, and saved it and made it last until today. Thank you for that question.
Any other questions? I also have my laptop here, so if anyone has questions online, just put those in the Q&A box. I have a question, Aseel.
Yeah.
We know of Bartram's as one of, or or America's first botanic garden. How do we know that?
I mean, I would like, what does it mean exactly? I think sometimes they call him America's first botanist. What does that mean exactly? I don't know. I don't really know the answer to your question, Greer, but I would say that he is a European that came to North America, was really interested in plants, and wrote a lot of things. Communicated with a lot of people about what he was doing and what he was seeing. And I think that just kind of gave him that title. Um, is that to say that he knew more about plants of North America than others? I would say no. And he would tell, like you can see in his writings, both him and William, they were learning a lot from indigenous people about plants, about what they were called, about how they were used, about where to find them. So they knew that they didn't hold all of the knowledge. I think we sometimes, when we look back at history, have a way of kind of elevating people to the best of something or the most of something. But I think he really was an early European that was curious about North American plants and had the wherewithal and the knowledge to write to people all across the globe about what he was seeing, and that's been preserved in our history.
We have another great question online, somewhat related. How well preserved are the original plants Bartram brought there?
There are some really old plants in the garden. There's some very old trees in the garden. Not all that Bartram brought there, like William. Other people would bring them things too, right? So they had all these friends that were gardeners, and people would bring them. Like we have what's thought to be the oldest ginkgo in North America, but it was given to William Bartram as a gift by William Hamilton of the Woodland Estate, who was traveling in England and found someone who had these ginkgo saplings from Japan, actually, and he had them sent over and asked William to plant one one was a gift to him, and he asked him to plant 3 on his estate at the Woodlands, and William complied, but that came as a gift. So there are trees that date to the 1700s. There's a really old London plane that I don't think we have the date of exactly, and there's a really old yellow wood tree that's probably from 1800 or just earlier.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions?
Would you say that Bartram was part of the age of botanical exploration? Did he travel? Was he traveling to other countries, to the Asia or the subcontinent to import plants, or was he primarily interested in what he could find in North America?
He was born in North America in 1699. He was born in Darby, Pennsylvania, and he never left this continent. He was here the whole time, but he did travel all along the East Coast. He had always hoped to get like as far west as the Mississippi, but he didn't. He got to the Ohio River, was as far west as he got. He went all the way north to like Lake Ontario, all the way south to Florida, all in the search of plants. And then his son also traveled. His travel is really well documented in a book that he wrote called Travels. And he did make it to the Mississippi and traveled a little bit, traveled through several states in the South in a really well documented way. And a kind of a beautiful book if you don't know it and want to look into it. This book Travels, where he talks, it's kind of like an early, kind of very early example of a travelogue. Like he talks about places he was seeing and plants he was seeing and people he was encountering in a really poetic way. It's a really lovely piece of naturalist writing.
Great question.
So in these travels, would they bring plants back to plant in the garden?
They would bring plants back. William would draw plants, would study plants, would bring back like his drawings of plants, and they were always communicating them to other people. Like John Bartram was in regular correspondence with Carl Linnaeus in Sweden about the plants that he was seeing in North America. He had a counterpart named Peter Collinson in England who kind of would be the person that would connect him to gardeners who were going to buy his plants, but also connect him to kind of like the network of wealthy people in North America that he could go down and visit in different states that could kind of help him and kind of like afford him the luxury of being able to travel to these other cities and go into the woods, find plants and study the plant ecology there.
Well, thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You had mentioned it just to tie it back, and I think it's so wonderful how your programming is really trying to connect what could be a very rarefied, closed off historic site, but to connect it to that community. And you had mentioned that the also was a large African immigrant community, and I was just curious whether in the garden, the farm that you mentioned, if there's efforts to bring in the African community to, they have different foods that are traditional to their culture and cuisine, and if there's much of that going on, that sharing, and maybe how the, historically African American population in that neighborhood are relating to the newer immigrants. If that's something that's happening there.
Well, certainly the first part where we're trying to connect with all the different kinds of people that are in the neighborhood is certainly part of the work we're doing. So we're always kind of connecting with organizations in the neighborhood that are specifically working with the African immigrant population to see how we can support them. And we are kind of like hosting events, hosting health fairs, and doing those kinds of things and talking about food and kind of bringing people together. I think that other connection that you're talking about is certainly a goal, right? To kind of bring the people that are connecting with us to have them all connect together is also a part of what we're trying to do. And I think those kinds of things happen at the farm or inside different kinds of programs that we're working on.
That was a great final. Oh, one more question. We're going to have another great final question.
Your first slide was a young man on a horse.
Yeah.
Do you have horses there for campers to ride? Because I know there's a large black cowboy section of Philadelphia.
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question also. So we're fortunate to be a partner with one of the original concrete cowboys who's in Southwest Philadelphia and has a couple of horses in the neighborhood very close to the park. And he was looking for some land to keep his horses and build a stable. And we're currently in the process of working with the city to kind of allow a stable there on our site so that Malik can do his programming there with his horses. But you see them, yeah, and you'll see them at our events and things like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Aseel. I really can't think of a better way to end our series than to see, that this incredible community work that you all do. So thank you to you and your team for everything that you do and for sharing it with us tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a wonderful evening and feel free to grab some snacks on your way out as well.